and welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. And my guest today is Michaela Boehm. How are you, Michaela?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good, thanks. And thanks again for coming on the show. So, Michaela, you're an expert in intimacy, relationship, and sexuality. You're a speaker, a counselor, and you've got this unique body of work that centers around the intersection of intimacy and embodiment. And that's one thing I want to speak with you of today. You are the creator of the NonLinear Movement method, and this is a somatic release modality which utilizes principles of trauma therapy, polyvagal theory, and movement for the nervous system regulation. And you've also got your book, The Wild Woman's Way. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I wanted to ask you first off, as we get into the non-linear movement method, too often I find as humans, we're very involved in our mind. We're thinking from the mind. We view our world, from our perception of what's in our mind. And I find it's usually, people who work in laborious jobs and even athletes, they're the ones who are, mostly off their body and, less of the mind. Whereas I find most of, the rest of the people, they're sort of very intellect based and very mind based. How's that come to be? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it makes sense. And I think it's also important to understand that as human beings, we have different faculties for different things, right? So meaning when you consider how humans evolved, we first had to survive by our body doing the things the body does to survive, right? And that meant hunting and sleeping and reproducing and all of those kind of things, which were very body-based. And of course, when you look at our nervous system and the way our brain works, the artifacts of that survival and the need for survival, that's still the first basic driver, so to speak. Then comes everything else. Now, then, of course, as we evolved and continue to do so, both as a species and as far as the brain goes, and when you look at how society has evolved, there is more and more value and need and demand placed on cognitive function. Right? I mean, you can't operate a computer unless you know what you're doing, right? You can find some food unless you're a complete idiot. You can probably, find some food out there and eat it and find some water and drink it. And that doesn't take any other skill than being able to identify a water source and a food source. But if you have to, go on Zoom, you need to have a certain amount of cognitive function to do that. It's a very silly, simple way to say that. So hence, where we live and how we're living right now, particularly now that there is very little human-to-human contact, or was for a while now, we are, of course, needing to use a lot of brain power and mental faculty and the ability to network activities and thoughts and all of that. And that's required for making a living. That's required for, having effective conversations and communication and all of that. So most people for most of the day have to use their mind like that. And of course, because we're creatures of habit, everything we've ever learned has been established by repetition. And of course, whatever you do the most is the most established habit. And hence, if you spend 12, 14, 16 hours on devices and a computer and thinking and talking and writing, then that's your biggest muscle, so to speak. Well, if you're an athlete and your job is to run the best time in marathon, and you do that every single day for hours on end, then that's your biggest muscle. It's not to say that you couldn't think, but it's not the predominant habit pattern. You're more concerned with your body being in optimal shape and so on and so on. So those are my thoughts on why is it that we're in our head. I think it's useful but it's an incomplete use of the human body, so to speak.
Yeah, no, those are some very good points. And I like that you mentioned those, especially in the sense that, when we're born as babies who are very physical oriented, crawling, learning to walk, moving our hands and our legs a lot. And then as the cognitive function develops, like you're saying, we have to learn how to do things with our intellect to, navigate through the world. And you're also right about, it almost seems that society is set up for you to function cognitively primarily, then somatically with your body, unless, you happen to be, again, a laborer somewhere, that type of job, or an athlete. And that's really important that you say also that what you do the most, is the habit that, you will architect the most. And, I'm reminded of myself, a lot of my work is, a desk job. And I have to, maybe every half hour or 1 hour, forcibly get up and move around and shake my body a bit. Because if I get used to sitting on the chair all day long, that'll be my repetitive habit pattern, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think we should also mention when we talk about that is that there's no need to fetishize the brain or the mind power, right? But there's also no need to fetishize the body as the be all end all. What it really is understanding how energy moves in the body and what is needed for what, and then creating optimal behaviors and optimal habits. So whatever you're doing, you can do so with, maximum output. And so when you are, sitting at a desk, you'll need all the brain power, all the power in your body to think. But then if your body goes offline, so to speak, you're losing, a very important faculty, which is kind of the more, let's say, feeling intuition-based aspect of your being, right? So then getting up and moving has two, primary functions, one of which is, of course, to make sure that your body doesn't atrophy and that you, keep healthy habits of engaging with the body, but also by moving your body and bringing the body back online, you are bringing online functions in the body that will help you perform a better job in the thinking part, so to speak, right? So yes. It's quite fascinating when you look at how energy travels in the body, and I mean that literally because not in the esoteric or new agey sense, but in the sense that from the cortex of our brain we emit electrical energy, and that energy goes where it's needed most. And contrary to, let's say, a computer where we can update RAM, our brain, has a maximum output it's capable of. So based on that maximum output, the brain and the body have to selectively decide where to put energy. And so, for instance, if you do very intense thinking work, your body will automatically go still because it doesn't need to zap some of the energy that you can use for the task at hand, right? But at the same time, if you're running really fast, you're probably not going to have a lot of cognitive faculty because everything is needed to make your body propel forward at the fastest pace. Let's say if you're running from a bear or something like that, right? So it's good to know what's what, and then you can use it to the best of your judgment and ability.
Yes, and that's interesting to hear that the body might be conserving energy if you're doing a heavy weighted cognitive function, and vice versa. That if you're doing a physical activity, the cognition function will take the back seat. And do you think any of this can also have to do with laziness and maybe a bit of trauma? Because, a body at rest will stay at rest until there's that, inert force or some sort of propulsion to get it back into motion. Do you think trauma has anything to do with why people might be, sitting on the couch a lot and not maybe wanting to move their bodies as much, or maybe laziness, just sort of being receptive to maybe watching a movie and again, not moving their body. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, lots of thoughts on that, right? So there's a wide spectrum. I think that we have to consider when we look at trauma-based approaches to, being optimally utilized in the world, right? We have to be careful that we don't apportion too much or too little, to one thing. And so what I mean by that is every human being who has lived, any kind of life has some injuries. And so when we look at trauma as an injury that has occurred simply, right, then that spans a very wide range of possibilities. So an injury could be a fall or a surgery. So it could be physical. An injury could also be emotionally something happened, right? A breakup or abusive parents or, whatever. And then, of course, there's also, the kind of trauma where, let's say, there was physical abuse or sexual abuse or some tremendous loss occurred, right? So all of that are various forms of injury. You can also have a spiritual injury, so to speak, meaning, you break with your religious belief system, or you had a traumatic loss and it makes you lose faith, or, there's all kinds of injury. So whenever the body, let's say it differently, whenever the nervous system detects injury, the body goes into survival mode. And that's how, humans survive. I'm phrasing this very simple. These are fairly, intricate processes, but sure. Just for the sake of making sense of that, anytime there's an injury, the nervous system goes into survival and protection mode. And so in the survival and protection mode, we have 4 basic ways of dealing with it. The 2 main ones that everybody knows about, because they're also directly connected to sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, is fight and flight, right? So it's fairly simple to understand how we would go into fight if there's an injury, or into flight if there's an injury or potential injury. But there's 2 other ones that are not always considered, one of which, and that's what you're referring to when you're talking about people getting inert, one of which is freeze. And I'll talk about freeze in a moment. And then there's a 4th one that's sometimes discussed in, but in certain contexts, and that is sometimes called fawn, right? And so what that is essentially flattering the perpetrator, like bonding with the perpetrator. In the olden days, this would be called the Stockholm syndrome, where you essentially go into the mode of keeping your enemy very close, so to speak, as a means of survival, right? So, and that's still something that's being fleshed out for a lot of people. But I found it very useful. I used to work with people in drug rehab in the early 2000s, and there's a lot of, so to speak, trauma bonding around, staying connected with people who are actually very bad for you. So that's a whole other thing, but we're talking about the body and inertia. And so the freeze mechanism is a very specific mechanism in which the nervous system down-regulates the body in a very specific way so you can live. And so if you once again look at evolution, right, and you look at how people, let's say in the savannah, had to survive, you can imagine that freeze would come in very handy if you had to hide in the tall grass, either because, I don't know, a herd of buffalo or a neighboring tribe or something like that, right? So in that moment, the less the system needs, the better. So in freeze, it typically down-regulates heartbeat and breathing. A lot of people describe kind of a numbness in the legs, heaviness, numbness in the legs. There's a kind of you feel fine, but you're very dull, you're somewhat dislocated, very quiet. Some people stop blinking, in the extreme cases. So that's, of course, really, really useful when you have to not make a move in the tall grass. It's not so useful when you have to live your life, right? And so there's, of course, acute freeze in relationship to an actual situation. And then there's chronic freeze, which comes from unexamined or unresolved or ongoing trauma, where the person just freezes a bit. And in that context, sitting around, not doing much, being on the sofa, being kind of inert can be one of the symptoms, right? And yes. And we've all had those moments, right, where what you really want to do is sit on the sofa, eat some ice cream, barely blink and stare at Netflix or something like that. Right? So there's that. So that could be a trauma response, and that definitely can be undone. And we'll talk about nonlinear movement as a means of undoing that in a second. But the other thing I wanted to say is, when it comes to laziness, there are habit patterns we develop as humans that are not optimal, let's say, for the body and for the functioning of the body, but that also have to be looked at as a means of protecting something. And that is that most people have too much going on. And most people are chronically tired, don't get enough sleep, they're chronically stressed, fatigued, they're chronically overworked, over-demanded upon. And in absence of good, well-adapted coping, right, meaning doing things that help the body repair and rest and constructively release stress, what we tend to do is sit on the sofa, watch a movie, eat something comforting that, kind of ups the feel-good hormones, which sugary, carby foods do, right? And that's our attempt to kind of regulate that overwhelm. And so it's not very useful to just call oneself lazy, even though that might be the case. It's really important to look a little bit deeper and see what is it that's actually trying to happen, and how could that be made possible in a way that is more conducive to a fulfilled, happy life with a healthy body.
Got it. Yeah. No, I'm really glad you explain both of those in depth, because, people after hearing this will know that they have a choice, that, this is not something that's beyond their control. They don't necessarily have to be a victim to it. And all it takes is, a little bit of awareness, because we have a will, and with, awareness and ignition, we can use that will to try to reset, the negative pattern that we might have gotten into. So thanks for mentioning that.
Mm.
And with the non-linear movement method, what is that? If you can explain it in a basic way.
Yeah. So I should say the backstory to this, to make sense of why I developed it, is essentially I realized in my training as a counselor and in the very brainy and analytical work of trying to figure out people's psyche, what was missing was that exact thing that I'm now talking about, which is having attention on the somatic system, right? Having attention on the nervous system, the way the body works, the way the body and the mind work together. And so I realized very quickly that I had much, much better results with my clients. And like I said, particularly in the rehab situation where people were extremely traumatized, both from drug use and often from the things that led to the drug use in the first place, which were often very, very brutal things. I realized that it would make a huge difference if the body was moved and attended to as a means of moving the mind and moving the trauma out of the body. And so the nonlinear movement method is a means of doing that. And it is a very non-impositional, and that's very important, the people who are properly trained. You know, we have certified teachers, and then there's just random people, you know, who came to a workshop, but properly trained people know how to do that without imposing, without forcing, without pushing, which is another way of, you know, making a stronger groove in the trauma path. If you kind of impose or try to create kind of a cathartic situation. So how it's done, teaching the body to take advantage of the built-in repair of that comes via the nervous system. And the nervous system knows how to produce homeostasis, knows how to release trauma from the body, old as well as acute. The nervous system knows how to downregulate. And when we facilitate when we know let's see how I can say this, when we know the mechanisms of those self-cleansing mechanisms in the body, so to speak, we can simply allow our body to take care of what the body does naturally, which sometimes is forgotten because of, you know, bad habits or the stress of the trauma or just lifestyle and things like that. So I developed the nonlinear movement method as something that allows people to really dislodge patterns and traumas and fight or flight states in a very, very simple way, where there's minimum interference by the facilitator, and where people learn how to trust their own body. And how it's done is very simply with the body as an ongoing movement, typically done on hands and knees, but people can also lay on their back. We've had people do it in wheelchairs, or there was a woman who used to teach the few remaining survivors of the Holocaust in a LA retirement home, and these were all women in their 80s and 90s, and they did it with sitting in wheelchairs and on chairs and on walkers, and they really, really loved it as a means of mobilizing some of that, stuck stuff in the body. So it can be done in any position except standing, and that has to do with how energy flows in the body. But it's a series of instructions that allows the body to start the process of unfreezing and releasing and down-regulating the nervous system. And then in the more advanced versions, there's also versions that enhance creativity and focus, vitality. There's a specific modality within the system that teaches the body to recognize and amplify pleasure, both sensual and sexual pleasure. It can be used both ways. So it's a very comprehensive modality, but it's super, super simple, and it can be done in a few minutes a day.
Oh, wow. You know, my reference point to trauma is the book, The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk. And until reading that book, it was not apparent to me that when trauma happens, too often we discount it as just an event, in a moment of time. And, once it goes away, that the trauma theoretically should go away. But, with the body keeping the score, there's many ways that the body actually, maintains the imprint of that trauma, both consciously and unconsciously. And here you're talking about dislodging the effects of the trauma, right? Such as with the nervous system and any effect it might have on the organs, etc. And with these movements that you've developed, are they sort of specific choreographed movements, or are they sort of random movements? Is there any sort of purpose to the movements you've devised?
Well, the reason it's called the nonlinear movement method is because they're completely random. So I essentially give a very simple set of instructions that allows the person to move with whatever they're feeling. And it's a means of tracking physical sensation and emotion and thought with just a random movement, however the body wants to move. And in a very, so it's not choreographed, it's done in a very contained way, so nobody watches that person. That person has the eyes closed. We kind of create an environment in which the body can just explore. And there are certain very specific aspects to it that have to do with how the nervous system works that make it so it facilitates that kind of specific process. But it's not choreographed. Like I said, there's no imposition from the facilitator on the practitioner. So there's no do this, don't do this, stop. It's essentially giving permission to connect with the body in ways that are beneficial for the body's self-cleansing and self-healing and release faculties. And within that, there's just some music, there's a bit of instruction, there's a lot of space given to the practitioner, or whoever, the participant, I should say, to just explore. What's interesting about that is that even people who've never done it, with a bit of time and space, just have the most interesting experiences because it has so little imposition.
Got it. And with the mechanism of the healing that's actually happening, is it that the trauma is stored as unresolved energy in the body, and with these movements the energy gets released, or does the energy just get dissolved or transformed into something else?
Well, it's a combination of things, because one of the big factors in releasing from the body or things storing in the body, let's start there, right? So when we have an injury, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, whatever, our body braces against that. And so that bracing has different components. So it has a mental component, an emotional component. There might be a coping involved, right? Or an action involved. And then there's the physical reality of it. So for instance, a very specific one is if you're driving along in the car and somebody sideswipes you, and you're lucky enough to not be massively injured, and you step out of the car, and you don't have to do the thing that we usually have to do, which is act in some way or interact with the person who hit us, right? If you would just stand there, and it happens anyway, but people typically try and counteract that. But if you would just stand there, your body would shake, right? Your entire nervous system would shake. There would be this, like the shaking. You'd feel shaky. You'd feel emotionally shaky. You might want to cry. Or for some people, they get very aggressive. They want to go for the person. Like you have these mechanisms in the body that deal with what just happened.
Yes.
And typically what we then have to do is we have to pull ourselves together, because now something's required. Either you have to speak with the paramedic, or you have to deal with the person who hit you, or you have to deal with getting the car out of the road, or you have children in the back of the car, or whatever. Whatever it is, you don't get to let the body do the thing the body would do, which is shake till the adrenaline has left your system. Have the nervous system down-regulate your breathing and your heartbeat after you exerted whatever you needed to exert to survive. Let yourself cry, which of course, brings out all kinds of really good hormonal processes that smooth your entire system. You don't get to do those things mostly. So then what happens is the body kind of solidifies around that experience. It gets stuck in the information that is, lodged in the body. And then now you go about your day and you forget all about it. You might even go to your therapist and talk about it. But every time you hear a certain screeching sound, you have a subtle clench. right? Or your heartbeat goes faster, or you get tunnel vision or whatever. If it's subtle enough, you might still ignore it or pull yourself together, which then of course makes it accumulate, and so on and so on. So, and this applies to everything. So there are patterns in the body that store all of that. When we do something like nonlinear movement method, which is a fairly kind of, it takes a bit of time to learn how to do it, but then you can apply it. But some people go to, their somatic experiencing practitioner or something, and they shake, or they go on a trampoline, or, there's all different kinds of ways people can work with their body on releasing what's stuck. And then often people do cry in a session, or they have a memory or a thought, right? Or they have a communication they really want to give somebody. And sometimes it's just a feeling, can also be a feeling of aggression, or a feeling that's kind of this creepy kind of heebie-jeebie kind of feeling, right? So it could be all those kind of things. And then that allows the body to kind of wash that out. And if you don't clench against that, and if you don't over-intellectualize it, sometimes when people have really, really established trauma patterns, nothing might happen for a few sessions, because the system needs to learn how to trust the process. But for some people, it's immediate, and it doesn't really matter if you know what's happening or not. It's just incredibly beneficial to move your body in random, nonlinear ways. And this is also true, by the way, for things like dance, if it's not choreographed, or playing with your dog, in nature, or climbing a tree or whatever. There's many, many ways that we can facilitate that release from the body.
I'm glad you mentioned dancing, because that's one of the easiest, fun ways to do this somatic therapy, is just, go out with your friends and have a good time dancing, or even at home, put on some music and dance and just shake it all away.
Yeah. Yeah, and shaking, by the way, and shaking things out, and all of that. Those are the ways that the body can set themselves right. And there's if you work with something like nonlinear movement in a therapeutic way, which I did for many years, because I saw people in a therapeutic setting, then you can combine that with certain sounds or certain words or things like that, right? You can engage more or less of the vagus nerve regulation and things that you can therapeutically use. And when I teach it to practitioners, we have lots of people who are therapists and psychiatrists and who use it in their practice. And then there's just people who teach freestanding classes where they just facilitate that in people without anybody having to really know what is exactly happening, because there's also, of course, always the X factor of the genius of your body inviting itself, which it does. The body is built to right itself, to repair and heal itself. And so, when you feel like dancing, you should definitely dance, because that is one of the ways the body knows how to right itself.
Got it. And, I'm reminded of children who naturally move and dance and shake and jump, and which is why their energy flow is open, right? Because they're constantly doing these things.
Yeah, and there's many beautiful movements these days. The natural movement, like movement modalities that really engage us like we were engaged as children. And there is something so profoundly healing about that and natural about that. And even if you have nothing to heal, just regular ongoing motion is what the body was built for. We were certainly not built for sitting still. And so, I can't say enough about moving a lot, but of course, when you have to sit at a desk and do office work, there's only so much you can do. So then you have to make the movement you do really do double or triple duty, so to speak.
Yeah, at least start by moving your chair up and down.
Yes.
Breaks.
Yes.
Listen, I'm really glad you came on this episode and shared your thoughts, because, like we were saying earlier, and especially you mentioned it, that, we are living mostly in the cognitive mind. And really, it's a balance of the cognitive mind with the embodied, embodiment sense of living, as well as with the spiritual sense of living. And just as how you have meditation to the mind, I think this work that you do with nonlinear movement method is meditation for the body itself. So thank you again for doing that. And if people want to get a hold of you or your work, where's the best place to reach you?
Well, my website has absolutely everything. So michaelaboehm.com, and I'm assuming you'll post that in the show notes, right? So
yes,
because it's a bit interesting to spell, but it's essentially like Michael with an A at the end and then Boehm. So michaelaboehm.com. And on there is in-depth shows and Q&As and everything about nonlinear movement. There's a home practice on there. There's the embodiment toolkit, which has a short guided nonlinear session as well within the embodiment toolkit. I also teach every other week while I'm not traveling. So, and that's for all time zones. So I teach nonlinear movement twice a week, every 2 weeks. So it covers UK, Europe, US, Australia, and New Zealand in those time slots. And there's also podcasts that are free where we cut some of my teaching together and conversations. So there's lots of material that people can find low cost or totally free.
Okay, great. No, I'll definitely put that in the show notes. And once again, thank you for coming on the show. And I wish you
are very welcome. Thank you very much. Oh, I should probably also mention while we're at that, if people want to train, we do teacher training twice a year. The next one's in October. So that's that requires an application and interview, but that's still available as well. So.
Okay, and that's through the website as well, right?
That's also through the website, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks once again.
Thank you.
Okay.